Hello, everyone. Welcome in. Hello. I see folks are, I'll give it just 30 more seconds and then we'll jump in. All right, well, welcome. I'm excited to speak to you today about how managers can build a culture of inclusion. So I am your facilitator today. My name is Dr. Marshawn Hyman, and I currently serve as the Director of Learning and Advisory Services for the Grads of Life team. So 3 essential skills to increase your impact. There are 3 elements today that we're going to cover to ensure that we build cultures of inclusions in our workplace. First, we'll talk about relationship building. Second, we'll talk about individualized coaching. And then we'll end our session today talking about feedback. This is going to be a quick round of thoughts. I want to engage you as well with a Menti poll, but hopefully we can take 3 concrete strategies away to build back into our teams. So first, let's talk about relationship building. So there's something called an empathy interview. And through 20 years of work with our parent company, Year Up, we've developed a tool that helps you build relationships in the workplace. And there are 3 elements that I'm going to quickly talk about today in regards to the empathy interview. So first, the purpose. The purpose of an empathy interview is to build connection and understanding with your employees. That's the initial goal, right? The impact is that it sets the tone for the manager and employee relationship. So this is something that you should do as you meet a new employee, but this is also something that you can employ once you go back to your companies today. Right? And then lastly, the how. An empathy interview is a short 30-minute, maybe 45-minute conversation if it's going well, right? But a short conversation that is one-on-one between you and an employee, and it uses open-ended questions to generate conversation. Typically, a closed-ended question is like a yes or no, but we want to actually have the employee articulate their thoughts and kind of really build on what it is that they like to say. So in an empathy interview, there are a couple different questions. And in a moment, I'm going to give you a whole list of questions that you can take back with you. But here are just a few sample questions that can kind of begin a great empathy interview. So I'll give you just a second to read over the screen. Okay, great. So in a moment, I want you to practice what this feels like so that when you engage in an empathy interview with a colleague or with an employee, you will then be able to know what it's like to be on the other side of the table. So we're going to go into breakout rooms. I'm going to give you 5 minutes. So you'll get just quick 5 minutes. What I'd like you to do is to choose one person to be the interviewer and one person to be the interviewee. Right? The interviewer will choose 1 or 2 questions to ask the interviewee, and that person can then respond. Of course, you can answer to the level of your comfort, and you'll then engage in a quick conversation. After 5 minutes, we'll come back and we'll take a few minutes just to talk about what that experience is like. Just so you have it, I'm going to give you a full list of questions that you might be able to use. Give me 1 second. Okay. You should be able to click on that link and utilize that in the breakout group. Okay, so give me 1 quick second. Oh, it looks like I actually don't have access to breakout rooms. Could someone support with that?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't know there were breakout rooms. Do you want them just randomly assigned?
Yes, can we just do pairs randomly assigned?
Okay, so do you want 2 by 2?
That's correct, yep. So 2 people in each room.
Give me a second.
Thank you so much. And we'll do 5 minutes.
This is interpreter number 4. I have a question. Does anybody need an interpreter during their breakout session, a sign language interpreter? So if you do, you might want to assign the interpreter to that breakout session.
Okay, let me know if anyone. If you have anyone needs an interpreter. Okay. Okay, it seems most people have gone to their room. Did you know if anyone needed interpretation?
I didn't see anything in the chat or
Okay.
nothing came through for me. So. Can you give me like a minute heads up? Is that possible?
Yeah, you said 5 minutes total, right?
That's correct, yes.
Do you maybe want to explain to the people who are coming in, if anyone comes in late, would you be willing to explain to them what's happening?
Oh, sure. So at the start of the new section, kind of give a
Oh,
quick.
no, sorry, just if anyone comes in while they're in the breakout rooms.
Oh, yes. Okay.
Sorry, I actually don't know exactly what time I started to open them at. Do you think like 3 more minutes is good?
Oh, okay. Let me see here. Let me check my time. Let's do another just minute. And that should be
Okay.
fine. Yeah. Thank you. Hey, April, thank you.
Okay, so if you're ready, I will let people back for the main session.
Perfect. Thank you. Cool. And is everyone back? Is that correct?
It says they still have 25 seconds to get back.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Okay, everyone should be
Thank
back
you,
now.
Ariel. Okay. Awesome. Okay, welcome back, everybody. So I hope that was an opportunity just to quickly experience a empathy interview. So I love to hear from you all. Here's a Menti link that I'm going to send in the chat. If you can click on that, it'll take you directly to the Menti. No name is associated with anything. It is anonymous. But I'd love to hear from you what resonated about that activity. So put a couple of thoughts in the chat, or excuse me, in the Menti. What resonated about that? One-on-one connection got real fast. I love that. Connecting personally, getting to know more about the person's heart and experiences rather than just what they can produce. Love it. Can be a little scary and a little exciting all at once. It causes self-reflections and centers the person's experience. Love that. How open and welcoming my partner was immediately. Love it. Each question is full of possibility. Learning about what pushes / motivates us to keep doing this work. Love it. Cool. I appreciate you all throwing that in there. Is there someone willing to come off mute and kind of give a voiceover on what they put into the Menti? Anybody? One person maybe?
Dr.
Right.
Hyman.
Yes, Craig, go ahead, Craig.
Yes, sir. I didn't put anything because I went to room 18 and nobody joined me. So I
Oh, I'm
felt
sorry.
very sad. So I'm loving all these comments though, but waiting to hear from others. It was great idea. I like the questions.
Cool. Thanks, sir. I appreciate your engagement, even though you weren't able to participate, Craig. Thank you. Is there someone that did participate want to give one thought?
Dr. Hyman, this is Michelle. I'm happy to kind of jump in and share. Sort of mine was it causes self-reflection and centers the personal experience. And I think more and more in the workplace, if you can value strengths that individuals bring to the workplace, but how they bring that strength or how they've developed that strength, it might have been through positive reinforcement. It might be through a failure or a mistake, which I hate even using those words, but I think really being able to understand not just sort of the strength or experience somebody brings, but how they came to own that as a strength or an experience, I think is really important as understanding people that we work with.
Yeah, I love that, Michelle. Thank you so much and good to see you. Yeah, absolutely. So this is about relationship building, but also about learning about how my employees learn, how they are best engaged, right? How they've developed skills over time. And we can even uncover some things that we may not have known, some other strengths we may not have known about them, right? So I encourage you to use this, take this back to your teams and let me know how it goes. Cool. All right, so let's jump back in. The relationship building is extremely salient for Black employees specifically, and I want to give you just a couple data points. And actually, can I verify you can still see my screen? Just a quick thumbs up. Yes, awesome, thank you. All right, so attrition. When we think about attrition, the attrition of Black employees it is persistently disproportionate to those of other races and across all seniority levels. One particular study at the University of Arizona and Columbia found that it is also 11%, it's almost as high as 11% in the first 2 years of employment, right? So it's really important that we think about building relationships and retaining our Black employees. When it comes to sponsorship, 67% of Black employees report that they don't have a sponsor in the workplace, and that impacts their growth and their ability to move up in the company. And then lastly, 64% of Black employees say that they can bring them full selves to work, right? So learning more about who they are, why they are, how they've come to be in those particular strengths will support in retaining Black employees over time. So this is important for everyone and more important and specifically for our Black employees. Cool. So now let's go to skill number 2, and that is individualized coaching. It's important that we think about our employees as individuals rather than simply just a team. And it's important that you then shift the way you approach those conversations and approach how you interact with them differently. So I'll give you a quick story. It's important that we focus on strengths. Some of you may have heard about the Oakland A's baseball team. They are a baseball team based out of California. There's actually a movie on Netflix now called Moneyball, I believe it is. So check it out, it's a great movie. What was interesting about this team is that they actually won, and they set a record for 20 games straight, and that record has not been broken for their particular team. They didn't win with the best players, right? So this coach didn't go out and just find the best players in the MLB. Right? What they found were players that were great at what they did, right? And in fact, they were the cheapest budget, right? So they were paying the least for their players, and they were trading for players that other teams did not want. Right. What was so unique about the approach that the coach took was he found people that were great first base players, right? They were great outfielders, right? They weren't just the best, but they were great at what they did. And because of that, they were able to excel and create a long winning streak. All right. So I want to give you a couple of techniques about how you might personalize your coaching. And there are 5 here. So one, it might be an orient to a role, right? So this is a new employee, right? Maybe an employee has additional responsibilities. Maybe an employee just got promoted. You're not going to approach this conversation from how we actually support you in onboarding and moving forward. Maybe it's a quick connect, right? Like, hey, let me talk to you just for 5 minutes. Let me kind of show you can identify a quick strength that I noticed, right? Or can I identify some barriers that might be happening? This is a 5 to 10-minute conversation, right? Maybe it's a check-in, right? We actually need to sit down and talk about some feedback that I'm seeing. Maybe you give me some feedback, right? This is different depending on what's happening for that employee. And then fourth, there might be development, right? Hey, actually, I see a need to improve, right? So now let's talk about your performance over time and ensure I'm giving you some strategies to improve. And then 5 is a progress review. I think we all are most familiar with this, and that is we're going to talk about your performance for the year, right? Or for the quarter, or for whatever time it might be, right? These conversations will look differently depending on where each employee is. Now, if we were to go a layer deeper, there are specific high impact questions that you could ask depending on what the employee needs, right? So you'll see here 4 categories of questions, right? And this is not an exhaustive list, just to be very clear, but here are 4 general categories that you might consider. One is information gathering, right? So if there's something happening, you can say, hey, tell me kind of what happened from the beginning, right? I want to better understand what's going on, right? There's empathy building, right? So I actually want to see from your perspective what happened and why you think that happened. There's problem solving. So putting the employee in the position to own their own performance. Say, hey, what do you think should be next steps? Right. And then lastly, learning from experience. Based on what happened, how might you approach this differently moving toward the future? All right, so again, there are 5 general techniques that you might use to coach. And then here are 4 categories of questions that you might use to guide that coaching conversation. Now, I love to kind of hear from you quickly. And I'll give you another link in the Menti. I'd love to hear from you. What techniques do you think you employ most often? Right. And there's a link there for you. If that doesn't work for some reason or if something's happening, please let me know. Okay, so it looks like, so check-ins are very popular. Okay, cool. And then the other 4 are pretty, okay, great. Anyone want to come off mute, kind of give me their reaction to this? Why do you think check-ins might be most popular? Or if you do another one, I'd love to hear about that as well.
I can comment. This is Celia in Albuquerque.
Thank you, Celia.
Just looking at this, definitely check-ins can be the most kind of, maybe in some ways the easiest and more likely that you might have a scheduled check-in. But I do know that from my experience with this, it's really important to have structure around all of these different components, meaning timelines and a regular date. Because I think, unfortunately, a lot of times in our busy work, this becomes the last thing because we're focusing on whatever our work focuses on, but support of employees can be kind of a last afterthought. So I think having regular development meetings scheduled, whether quarterly or twice a year, just having them on a calendar can really help us with the other components because they just may not happen if we don't make an intentional effort to have them on a calendar. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Celia. I love that. Yeah, I think check-ins typically we do have on the calendar. It might be weekly, it might be every other week, but how often do we then prioritize just giving a quick piece of feedback, right? Or actually investing in someone that might need some development. So I appreciate that. We can do one more person. Anyone want to come off mute, kind of tell me what you're thinking, what's resonating with you?
I can share a little bit. This is Corinne. I'm in Philadelphia, and I just shared that I think there are some of the more structured or more formal types of check-ins that someone put in the chat. These are often mandated through HR or just things that you have on your calendar. But I think it was Celia, I think, who said there are ways to, or it's helpful to have structure even in the more informal ones. And I like this framework of including the quick connect as a way to just touch base and have that touch point with the person that doesn't make them feel on edge or feel that they have to come prepared or come this is a check-in. So I need to come with my my big to-do items that I need to talk about. It's something that's a little bit more human and organic, but still can be structured in a way that is helpful and informative to both me as a manager and to the people that I manage too.
Thank you. And what was your name again? I just see the Yes Project.
Sorry, it's Corinne.
Corinne. Okay, thank you so much, Corinne. Yes, I love that so much. And I know for me, especially in the past, one-on-ones would be very intimidating, right? Let me get my agenda together, then make sure I send it the night before. But actually kind of shifting the way that we have check-ins with folks can minimize that and actually make those formal check-ins more impactful and more supportive of that person's growth. I love that. We can maybe do one more person if there's someone that'd like to jump in. Great. All right, so we've talked about the importance of relationship building. I've given you just a few data points around the importance of relationship building, specifically with Black employees. We talked a little bit about personalizing your coaching and the approach that you take with employees. And then lastly, I like to talk about feedback. So feedback is an important skill, and I'm going to take you through a few ways that you might give feedback. But first, I love for us to, I'm going to give you another Menti. So I love for us to, if you think about your current practice, your current day-to-day practice, what is your current feedback ratio? Right. So when you think about your positive to constructive feedback ratio, what might that be? Right. And there's a Menti there for you. Yeah, so 3-1 seems to be leading. 2-1, we got some 1-to-1s, 1-to-2. Okay, so it looks like generally 3-1 might be the leading right now. Oh, some things are still changing though. Okay. So I'd love to hear from a couple of folks. We can do 2, maybe 3 people. Kind of talk to me about how you came up with that ratio, kind of, and how you practice feedback. And if that one person that put other is willing to come off mute, I'll also love to hear about that.
I can share. Something that I've been able to do to keep track of this is I have check-ins with my staff weekly, and when I'm writing notes on these check-ins, I'll put down I'll note when I've given positive feedback versus constructive feedback, and like how many and what those things were, and I'll note them with just like an asterisk or something like that like makes it very clear when I'm looking back at the notes. So then when I'm reflecting on my strategy for my check-in for the following week, I can look and see how much feedback I've given and how often, and if it's like time for some more or whatever.
Brandis, I don't think I've heard someone be so intentional about the type of feedback that they give. I love that, so I appreciate it. Jillian, I saw you shaking your head. Is something you would like to share, or you can say no, but
I'm happy to share. I was shocked at that level of organization and process. It's literally never occurred to me that I could and maybe should track that. I can see a lot of benefits, but I can also see that creates a lot of extra work at a time when time is short on a daily basis. So I guess I'm curious if that's a best practice or that's just something unique that works for the previous speaker.
Yeah, so to be very honest, I've never been that good at tracking my feedback. I don't know if I would say it's the best practice yet, because I would have to do some more reading. However, I'm going to share a piece of data in the next slide, and I think that tracking it could actually positively impact the team because of the ratio that is shown to influence high-performing teams. So I think there are a variety of ways, but maybe I'll throw it back to you if you're comfortable. Do you find that it's working for you, or would you recommend adding on to that strategy?
I feel like it definitely works. I think sometimes we get caught up with the logistics and the day-to-day and stuff like that. And it really takes me just like a couple minutes immediately after I check in with the staff member just to write a few quick notes. And I definitely feel like it is really beneficial for the staff and for me, just to kind of make sure that I'm kind of on track with the style that I prefer, which is a strengths-based leadership style.
All right, thank you. Is it Brandis? Am I saying that?
Yes, it is.
Okay, love it. Thank you so much. And thank you, Jillian. One more person willing to kind of share what's resonating with him?
I think one of the tricky parts, this is Michelle, I am based in Vermont. I think one of the trickiest parts of all of this is it's not just the ratio between you and the employee, but I think it's really important to contextualize what might be happening within the organization or within the team, right? So if you're in the middle of an evolution or a growth spurt where the organization is in a growth-minded or learning or fast-paced mistake-making mode, like you're probably going to want a 1-to-1 ratio because you're trying to embed strengths but quickly learn. And then when you're in more of a moment of stabilization and maybe more of like a professional development focus, you're more in that sort of 3-to-1 ratio. And I think it's just important to name for the employee kind of and contextualize like where the organization is, where the team is, because your ratio of feedback might be dependent on some of those external factors as well.
Thank you, Michelle. I appreciate that. I think the thing that's resonated with me is like setting clear expectations around what's happening and what's going to happen and why, right? So that we could then, and that's upbuilding relationships. I love it. Thank you so much. Cool. Okay, great. So I will share with you. So the high-performing teams on average have a 6-to-1 positive to constructive feedback ratio. And that's some research based on the Harvard Business Review, right? So, and that was really surprising for me to see, right? But in that particular study, the managers that gave 6 positive comments for each 1 negative or 1 constructive, their teams were performing higher, right? The lowest performing teams had a 1-to-1 feedback ratio. So I kind of want to walk you through quickly how you might give positive feedback. So I'll give you positive and constructive. So first, when you're giving feedback, you should give the strength, right? And it should be based in skills, right? So not that you look great today, right? But your project management was strong, your communication was strong. But what's the skill? Once you give the skill, it's important that you give the impact of that skill, right? So that folks understand how they are impacting and influencing the organization. Specifically for entry-level employees, it might be difficult to see how my work matters and what my work is doing in the organization. So helping folks understand how they impact people around them is impactful for them. And third, you should then praise the process, right? Oftentimes we say, man, you brought in that 20 million, that was great. You helped us sustain our revenue over the next 2 years, right? That's great, right? But actually helping employees connect the process they took to achieve that goal will support them in achieving more in the future, right? So for example, yes, you brought in the 20 million, but your persistence, right? You called that donor several times over the last month, right? That supported you in bringing in that 20 million. Or your ability to active listen and kind of reflect that back to the donor was impactful, right? That's important because if you give another assignment, maybe it's 40 million next year, as an employee, I'm thinking, oh man, can I do that? And rather it being based in my ability to raise 20 million, it's based on my ability to active listen. It's based on my ability to be persistent, right? And because of that, I know that I can get there, right? I think that the process is something that we need to bring back into giving feedback. And then when you give constructive feedback, the first 3 are the same, right? So give the area of growth. This thing needs to improve. Right? Why it needs to improve is this reason. And the Yes Project, I'm sorry, I forgot your name, but I see your hand.
It's okay. It's Corinne. I'm wondering, we're still looking at your Menti. I'm just wondering if you were sharing your screen. It maybe didn't switch to the slides.
Thank you so much for that.
Yeah, no problem.
I'm glad I didn't get all the way to the end. And I appreciate that. Give me 1 second, y'all. Can you see a PowerPoint now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I really appreciate that. Some folks will kind of let me go all the way through and they'd be like, oh, that was a great, great presentation. All right, so here, again, so strength, impact, and process. I hope that made sense. Maybe I'll pause for a second and just verify if anyone has any questions or thoughts on that.
Can you repeat what was under the strength bucket?
The strength is the thing that's gone well, right? And I'll push managers to think less about, I guess I'll say it should be rooted in a skill, right? So like, oh, like you look, so if I give you the example, you look so great today, right? Thank you, right? But if you say you do a good job of coordinating colors, right? That is a skill that I could bring as opposed to I look good, right? There actually was effort and thought into the way that I looked today. Does that make sense? Okay, I see thumbs up. Okay, great. So making sure that it is skills-based feedback. You then talk about the impact, right? So if I go with that same example, you coming and looking great, it makes people want to work with you, right? You bring warmth into the environment. You influence the way that I dress. Maybe I want to step up my wardrobe, right? That's the impact of me showing up looking good, right? And then you praise that process, right? Man, I appreciate you taking the time this morning to look at the colors and make sure that things were matched. You looked in the mirror, you called a friend, right? You did all those things to come in to positively impact the work environment, right? So no matter what you ask me to put on tomorrow, I know I got it because that process supported me in looking good. That's not a directly relevant example to management, but I hope that might paint a picture for you. Okay, so then for constructive feedback, it's the same three, right? So you give the area of growth, right? So I'd like to see you improve your follow-up, right? That might be the area of growth, right? The impact of that is not following up appropriately could negatively influence the marketing's team ability to get the ad out on time, right? If the ad out is not on time, the finance team can't submit the PO by the expected date, right? If that revenue does not come into the company, that then influences our ability to pay our bills and keep salary and things moving, right? Right. So the growth is the ability to follow up, and I explain the impact of that to my employee, right? And then I talk about the process, right? So I love to hear about how you schedule your follow-ups. What does that look like for you, right? And you kind of understand that what process that person took in following up with different folks around the company. The part that's different here for constructive feedback is a recommendation, right? It's really important that if we're thinking about building relationships and then bringing folks into us and retaining our employees, give them a recommendation, right? And it should be very clear that this is a recommendation, because once you go back and process this feedback, you actually might find a better way to do it. But in this conversation, I'm going to support you in getting started. Right? There are so many times, even now in my career, where folks will say, hey, this can be better. I'm like, great. What do I do? Right? So give a recommendation, help me get started. And when we come back to our check-in next week, if you have a better idea, great, run with it, right? And I can give you feedback on how well that is going. So I love to actually, well, for time, we'll pause there. I love just to hear from you, kind of what's resonating about this feedback framework. What's something you do well already? What's something that is new? Thank you, Dr. Jackson. I appreciate that. Ariella, Jillian, I'll get to you real quick. Ariella, yes, there will be a couple tools that I'll send to you, including a few slides from this deck. I appreciate it. Aurelia, thank you for that correction, even through chat. Love it. Jillian, would you like to jump in?
I was just going to say, well, I like this whole, both the feedback, the constructive feedback, and the individualized coaching felt like it was really focused on providing a lot of context. And so it feels like as you're trying to develop your team as individuals, each piece of feedback is growing upon the next because you're drawing out their strengths in real time. So I think to me, this felt like less of like a one-off, like here's some feedback because you didn't perform well, and instead it's here's how we're making you stronger overall and keeping you professionally engaged and developing as a vital piece of our organization. I don't know, it feels more meaningful this way than the way I was thinking about it before.
I love that. Thank you. I appreciate that. Yes, I will, even when I get growth feedback, kind of tell me, why is this important for me to be thinking about, and then what can I actually do, right? As opposed to that wasn't good. Well, yes, we probably know that wasn't good, right? Awesome. Okay. So I do want to make sure I respect your time and we get you out on time. So quickly recap. If you consider how you might maximize your impact, relationships are the foundation, right? So practice that empathy interview. You will get a tool after this to prepare for that. Personalize your coaching based on their needs, right? That empathy interview could support in understanding how your employees learn, what they might need from you, and then use those coaching techniques to move it forward. And then third, feedback is essential, right? Praise the process so that people leave growing, understanding, ready to tackle new problems, even if they don't have the hard skills. That process that they've used in the past can support them in growing further. Cool. And then 2 tools that you'll get the empathy interview planning template that'll come to you so you can think about how you might approach that. You'll also get some high impact coaching questions, right? So throughout this empathy interview or just in your general management, there are a lot of different questions that you might be able to ask to really elicit what you want from your employees that will help them give you what you need. Our website is grassoflife.org. And my email is there. We have maybe a few minutes, but if there are any thoughts, questions, reactions, I'd love to engage you for just a few minutes. Thank you so much for your time.